The galactic chamber buzzed with voices layered in dozens of languages, each carrying centuries of tension. For the first time in its long history, the Concord had invited a representative from Earth. The announcement was met with mild curiosity, concealed derision, and undercurrent of unease. No species truly understood what humans were, only that they were new, and that made them dangerous. Ambassador Helena Ward stepped into the chamber alone. She was not tall, not intimidating by any common measure. She bore no armor, no translator drone, no entourage, just a thin silver lapel on her collar, marking her as Earth's official envoy. The other delegates watched her carefully, recording every microexpression, parsing every blink as they tried to categorize her. She offered them nothing but a subtle nod and an unreadable smile. Her arrival was not ceremonial. It was strategic. For years, the Galactic Concord had teetered on the edge of collapse. The Shethar Dominion, an insectoid empire known for its strict honor code and territorial precision, accused the Ellerin Accord, a psionic, almost reptilian species, of violating ancient mining treaties along the asteroid belts of Sector 12. The Ellerins denied the charge and instead claimed the Shethar had falsified data and manipulated star maps to gain leverage. Neither side was backing down. Fleets were quietly mobilizing. Trade routes were collapsing under embargoes. War was inevitable. So they called in the humans, not to lead, not to command, but to observe. A gesture, nothing more. No one expected them to matter. Helena understood this perfectly. The first week, she said little. She observed everything. Where other species relied on logic trees and cultural archives to decipher intent, Helena relied on something far simpler: human pattern recognition. She noticed what others missed. The way the Shethar ambassadors paused a half-second before speaking, as if reviewing a consensus from elsewhere. The way Ellerin telepaths avoided direct eye contact when asked about their own fleet positioning. Neither faction was telling the full story. She wasn't surprised. What did surprise her was how little the other Concord members cared about truth. They were invested in process, rituals, historical precedent. The entire system was designed to delay collapse, not resolve conflict. She didn't have that luxury. Earth's seat at the table wasn't guaranteed. Provisional membership meant conditional presence. If Helena failed to defuse the conflict, Earth would be removed from the Concord entirely. No access to advanced trade, no protection from wandering fleets. Isolation, again. Humanity couldn't afford that. She began with subtle moves. Rather than file endless bureaucratic reports, she invited representatives from both factions to informal exchanges. Cultural shares, as she called them. She brought them Earth food, not replicated but grown on her ship, a quiet assertion of Earth autonomy. She told them stories, not negotiations. War stories, peace stories, fables with no point other than to see who reacted. At first, the aliens were confused, then curious. She learned that Shethar honor culture made them loath to show doubt publicly, but privately. They admitted that Ellerin fleet movements had caught them off guard. She learned that Ellerins deeply feared betrayal, not because of past wars, but because their neural empathy made them hypersensitive to perceived abandonment. They weren't posturing, they were panicking. Neither side wanted war. Both believed it was already too late to avoid it. That was Helena's opening. She didn't argue evidence. She asked questions, leading ones, not about territory or treaties, but about loss. What would war cost the Shethar in their caste systems? What would it do to the Ellerin neural bond networks, already frayed by fear? Every delegate deflected, but each question left a mark. Late one cycle, she received a private message. An Ellerin diplomatic aide named Rail asked to speak off the record. They met in a quiet communications relay room. He wore the sigil of his house, but dimmed, a gesture of personal rather than official speech. Rail admitted the truth. The Ellerins had been hiding something. Not a violation, but a defensive buildup. They had discovered Shethar weapon caches hidden within dormant mining platforms. Rather than escalate, the Ellerin High Circle ordered the information buried while their own countermeasures were constructed. They weren't innocent, but they weren't the aggressors, either. Helena pressed gently. Why not share this? Why not appeal to the Concord? Rael's reply was sharp. Because we are not human. We don't believe the truth saves anyone. That stayed with her. She returned to her quarters and reviewed every transmission she received from both sides. She fed them into her diplomatic analysis core, but the results didn't line up. Too many coincidences. Too many mirrored accusations. She started to suspect that neither the Shethar nor the Ellerins were the real drivers of conflict. Someone had been feeding both sides partial truths, just enough to keep them angry, just enough to delay resolution. She didn't share that theory. Not yet. She needed confirmation. Instead, she requested access to trade logs and long-range communications archives from neutral species operating in the contested zone. It was a procedural request, and most would have denied her, if not for a small, overlooked clause in the Concord Charter, a clause written during the Drenathy War, allowing provisional members to audit external conflict data in times of near crisis. It had never been used. She used it. Within days, anomalies surfaced. Encryption patterns hidden in neutral courier traffic. Timing mismatches between public transmissions and shadow data packets. Patterns not of diplomacy, but of manipulation. She didn't have proof, but she had direction. In her next report to the Concord, Helena didn't mention war. She spoke of misalignment, miscommunication. She compared the current standoff to ancient Earth rivalries, Cold War politics, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Concord members listened, unblinking. These human references meant nothing to them, but the Shethar flinched when she said, proxy war. The Ellerins blinked twice when she said, engineered escalation. Words, not accusations. Signals. She ended the report with a single sentence. We are not here to win arguments. We are here to stop patterns. The room was silent. One Concord elder, a sentient crystalline being, shifted forward for the first time in 2 cycles. And if the pattern does not wish to be stopped, Helena looked at each delegate in turn, then answered calmly, then we become the variable it can't predict. She left the chamber without waiting for acknowledgement. That wasn't her concern anymore. She had already started planning her next move, not to prove the truth, but to provoke it. Helena knew something was being orchestrated beneath the surface, but knowing wasn't enough. In a political environment where truth came second to consensus, she needed a deeper kind of leverage, one rooted not in evidence, but in perception. If she wanted the real power players to listen, she had to make them feel doubt, not just understand it. So she pivoted. Rather than confront the Shethar or the Ellerins directly, she leaned into confusion. She began engaging with minor diplomats, underlings, assistants, security aides. She asked simple questions during breaks. She shared out her sayings and waited for reactions. The strategy wasn't accidental. Unlike senior officials trained in deception, these individuals carried their uncertainty on their sleeves. It worked. A Shethar logistics officer mentioned, almost casually, that fleet readiness exercises had increased 3-fold in recent cycles. An Ellerin envoy's assistant expressed confusion about orders to withhold certain reports from the Concord. Little things, disconnected statements. Together, they painted a picture of centralized orchestration and fragmented execution. Someone was feeding both sides directives, then keeping them isolated enough to maintain plausible deniability. She sent fragments of her findings back to Earth. No request for support, just patterns. She didn't want interference. This had to stay small, surgical. To further destabilize the false confidence of both factions, Helena introduced unpredictability. She invited a Shethar caste leader and an Ellerin neural weaver to a shared diplomatic lunch. Nothing official, just a table, a human-cooked meal, and light conversation. The Concord whispered that it was a stunt. She didn't care. Both delegates arrived. Silent, suspicious. She spoke only of culture. She explained how humans laughed at funerals, how they voted leaders out of office without bloodshed, how they waged civil wars, then made movies about them, how they told lies to children to teach them truth. The aliens listened with blank expressions, but their posture shifted. Uncomfortable, curious, alert. She knew they were relaying everything to their superiors. That was the point. One of them would break soon. Later that cycle, her proximity sensors triggered. A lone Ellerin stood outside her diplomatic pod. Not Rail. This one wore higher insignia. His eyes glowed slightly, a side effect of deep-level psionic enhancement. His name was Seared. He didn't speak immediately. Finally, he said, "You are not what they expected." "I know," she replied. "You don't speak with certainty." "I rarely have it." Seared studied her for several long seconds. "That is unsettling. Only if you're used to obedience." He tilted his head. "Your logic runs sideways. Or yours runs in circles." He smiled. "Just barely. You are either foolish or dangerous. Why not both?" That broke the wall. Sear stepped inside and told her what no one else had. The Ellerin High Circle had intercepted encrypted Shi'ar supply routes weeks before the public accusations began. They hadn't responded diplomatically because they believed, correctly, that their channels were compromised. But even their own intelligence reports didn't explain why the Shi'ar had placed weapon caches near defunct mining colonies. There was no clear tactical advantage. Helena pressed again. What if it wasn't the Shi'ar? Sear didn't respond, but he didn't deny the possibility. That was confirmation enough. Helena spent the next hours reviewing data the Ellerins gave her. When she cross-referenced fleet positions with known Concord surveillance data, something jumped out. Several routes aligned perfectly with merchant traffic patterns, specifically Talvari Consortium trade ships. The Talvari were supposedly neutral, handling interstellar logistics and resource distribution for dozens of species. They profited in war and peace alike, but they had one defining trait. They never took sides. Unless, of course, taking sides guaranteed instability. Helena initiated a passive scan of Talvari ships in proximity to the disputed sectors. She didn't ping them directly, just gathered signals. Most were clean. One wasn't. Its relay signature had been scrubbed, rerouted through multiple Concord relays. When her system ran it through an ancient Earth forensic algorithm developed during the rise of quantum espionage, it flagged repeating metadata. The ship had transmitted to both Shi'ar and Ellerin diplomatic servers under different identities. Proof? Not legally, but operationally? Yes. Still, none of it mattered unless she could force the involved parties to expose themselves. She needed tension, exposure, an opportunity where their reaction would be more telling than their statements. She announced a diplomatic summit, not for peace, for cultural recontextualization, a sterile term, non-threatening. The Concord permitted it. Curiosity trumped caution. Everyone wanted to see what the human would do. The invitations were deliberately vague. She invited factions unrelated to the conflict, minor races, silent observers, Concord bureaucrats, and she invited the Talvari as logistical observers. A perfect excuse for them to show their faces in a high-pressure room without arousing suspicion. Then she staged a real message. Helena delivered a keynote on the role of misinterpretation in human history. She cited Earth events where flawed information led catastrophe. The Great Firewall Incident, the Martian probe panic, the mistaken retaliation drills of the Third Cold War. None of the aliens understood the specific references. That wasn't the point. The rhythm of her speech changed. Her tone sharpened. She asked how any species could claim truth when data itself could be rewritten, how certainty could be weaponized. She looked directly at the Talvari delegate when she said, and how neutrality often hides the deepest form of interference. There was no outburst, no denial, but the Talvari's pulse quickened. A small gesture, but for a species evolved to mass intent perfectly, it was enough. The Shi'ar and Ellerins, seated apart, both turned their heads toward the same Talvari representative. It was the first moment of true alignment between them in weeks. Helena ended the session abruptly, stating the cultural message was delivered. No questions, no follow-up, just a clean exit. Outside the chamber, she stood in silence, eyes closed. It was working. The idea had been planted. Not proof, but unease. A fracture in the manufactured narrative. The delegates would return to their governments confused, uncertain, off balance. That was the beginning of movement. Later that night, Her ship received a high-priority transmission. It wasn't encoded through Concord channels. It was local, anonymous. The message was short. "You're getting too close." She smiled. That meant she was exactly where she needed to be. Helena didn't reply to the anonymous message. She archived it, flagged it, and moved on. Fear was a reaction. Pressure was a signal. And someone had just blinked. She refocused her strategy. The Shidar and Ellerons were no longer a problem. They were pieces, tools being used. But the presence of the Talvari changed the shape of the board. If a logistics consortium could manipulate two superpowers into near war without leaving fingerprints, then the real battle wasn't diplomatic. It was informational. So she began to interfere, not with weapons, not with force, but with story. Over the next several cycles, Helena crafted a narrative, not an official statement, not an accusation, just a whisper, seated carefully. She spoke with minor delegates, independent traders, Concord observers. Each received a version of the same idea, that this conflict was less about territory and more about timing, that both fleets had been positioned for failure, that someone had nudged two great civilizations toward a cliff, then handed them blindfolds. She framed it as speculation, a thought experiment. That made it easier to share, and it spread. Soon, the Ellerin emissaries began making indirect inquiries, not to Helena, but to each other, wondering aloud how their early data had been so wrong, how communication routes were so easily scrambled. The Shidar followed, less directly, but with unmistakable pattern. Both sides began investigating their own internal intelligence chains. That was the first real crack in the illusion. But Helena didn't stop there. She submitted a formal request to access Talvari communications archives from the past 3 cycles, citing inconsistencies in their trade reports. On paper, it was a routine audit. In reality, it was bait. The Talvari refused, of course, politely, citing sovereignty. But the speed of their response was too fast, too rehearsed. Helena had seen humans lie. She knew the rhythm. This was the same. Now it was time for the second variable. She met with Rail again. Quietly, he had climbed in rank since their last conversation. His neural signature pulsed with more intensity. He was no longer a courier of secrets. He was now a vessel for them. Helena laid it out plainly. The Talvari are selling the illusion of neutrality. They're routing weapon signatures through ghost fleets, letting both sides think the other's escalating. Rail didn't deny it. He asked only one question. Why? Her answer was simple. Because chaos is profitable. He nodded once. Then he offered her something unexpected. There's a listening post. Deep orbit. Officially decommissioned. It still pings once every cycle. We never shut it off. She asked why not. He replied, because we knew someday we'd need a place to hide a question. It took 2 cycles to arrange transport. Helena used an auxiliary Concord shuttle, posing as a neutral observer conducting an infrastructure survey. Rail joined her, along with a single Shidar intelligence liaison. An unlikely alliance, but one bound by suspicion. Neither side trusted her, but they trusted each other even less. Perfect. The listening post was buried in magnetic distortion. No direct line of sight to Concord comms. When they docked, the lights flickered, barely functional, but the core systems were intact. Inside the archive, Helena found raw transmission data, compressed, outdated, and encrypted in a pattern older than modern Concord code. She ran a linguistic bypass, combining Earth military heuristics and Concord legacy keys. The files opened. They showed transaction routes, not just physical cargo, but diplomatic packets, message forging sequences, false flag operations. The Talvari hadn't just nudged the war forward. They had engineered every point of contact, routed every high-level transmission through mass proxies, seeded fake alerts on both sides. It was a full-spectrum manipulation, and it had been happening for years. Helena turned to the Shidar agent. You've seen this before. He didn't reply, but his mandibles twitched, the Shidar equivalent of a sigh. Rail stepped closer. If we present this to the Concord, we'll be told it's outdated, inadmissible. Irrelevant. They'll bury it, Helena said. Worse, they'll ask who gave it to us, and then they'll silence the source. She knew he was right. The Concord was not built for exposure. It was built for balance. Introducing truth into that system, unfiltered, unstructured, was like throwing fire into vacuum-sealed glass. It didn't explode. It shattered everything. So she pivoted. Again, they didn't need to convince the Concord. They needed to make the Talvari reveal themselves. Helena returned to main chamber, composed and unhurried. The usual diplomacy resumed. Trade disputes, sector alignment discussions, token peace resolutions. But beneath it all, a low hum of tension. Delegates glanced at each other more often, paused longer before speaking. The story was taking root. She asked for a private session with the Talvari envoy. It was granted. Predictably, she walked in alone. "You've been quiet," she said. The Talvari, a thin being encased in reflective plating, gave no expression. "We're observers. We speak when spoken to." "Then let me speak," she said. "You're losing control of the narrative." Still no expression, but the delay in response told her everything. "We found your echo routes," she continued, "your data scrubs, your backdoors into the Sheath-R tactical relays. We even found your transaction fingerprints embedded in the Ellerin distortion logs. It's a beautiful operation. I admire it. You have no jurisdiction. I don't need it." The Talvari's eyes narrowed slightly. She leaned in. "You're not afraid of discovery. You're afraid of panic. If the Concord realizes it's been compromised this deeply, half of these species will pull out of alliance negotiations. The other half will retreat into war bubbles. You need the system to look intact. You need the illusion more than the power." The silence that followed was confirmation. Then she delivered the kill move. "We leaked part of the data already. Not enough to prove anything. Just enough to sow doubt. But here's the catch, we lied." That broke his stillness. "There's no leak?" he asked. "No," she said. "There's a real leak. But now you don't know what part is real." He stood. "You are destabilizing the peace." "No," she said. "I'm destabilizing your monopoly on the narrative." And with that, she walked out, not with proof, not with a resolution, but with control. The chamber would soon flood with rumor. Every delegate would wonder what was true. Every alliance would question its own assumptions. Not enough for war, but enough for a pause. A gap, a moment to rethink. She had cracked the architecture, and now she just had to watch what fell. They called it a containment protocol. Within hours of her confrontation with the Talvari envoy, the Concord initiated lockdown procedures on all external diplomatic terminals. Transit permissions were frozen. Non-essential communications were rerouted. The official line was data stabilization. Everyone knew it was fear, but Helena hadn't come to start a war. She came to stop one. And the difference, she reminded herself, was execution. She returned to her quarters and sat alone in the dark. No messages in or out. No access to Earth. The Concord had severed links, but not as punishment. They were isolating her like a dangerous idea. Containment wasn't a wall. It was a silence loud enough to suffocate. She waited. On the second cycle, Rail slipped a data stick under her door. No words, just action. It contained fragments of movement reports from Talvari merchant ships, all of them rerouting or halting entirely. The Talvari were pulling back, quietly, rapidly, which meant they were scared, but fear made them unpredictable. And they weren't retreating to surrender. They were recalibrating. She needed a final move, something unignorable, something irreversible, not an attack, but a pivot in the story that no one could walk back. So she wrote a speech. It wasn't a broadcast. It wasn't scheduled. It was entered as a cultural philosophy statement, an obscure Concord clause designed to allow diplomats to share aspects of their species' mindset. No one had used it in decades. She walked into the central chamber with a single data crystal. There was no ceremony, no attention, just an open hall with a dozen half-distracted delegates waiting for routine procedural items. She began anyway. "I'm here to speak about failure," she said. "Not yours. Ours." That caught attention. She continued, "Humans evolved by misunderstanding. We thought stars were gods, thought disease was sin, thought difference meant threat. We were wrong, repeatedly, catastrophically. But each time we failed, we recorded it. We remembered it. We built entire institutions just to contain our past ignorance." A few delegates stirred. "We created museums of error. We canonized our worst decisions, so we'd never forget how dangerous certainty can be." Then she turned to face the Talvari envoy directly. "And we learned that those who profit from confusion never want clarity. They sell conflict like oxygen, quietly, invisibly, until every breath becomes leverage." Now the room was silent. Helena placed the data crystal into the projection unit. It didn't contain proof. It didn't need to. It contained stories. Unmarked ship logs, snippets of altered comm traffic, unverified testimony, mistranslations, all meaningless on their own. But when shown together in sequence with deliberate pacing, they told a narrative, not a court case, a pattern. The room didn't erupt. That would have been too clean. Instead, it cracked. Shidar delegates began whispering, cross-referencing known internal inconsistencies. Ellerin liaisons froze, visibly recalculating recent orders. Even neutral factions began checking their internal logs, wondering how deep the Talvari had gone. And the Talvari? They didn't respond. That was a tell. Helena concluded with one line: "We are not here to preserve peace. We are here to prevent its manipulation." She walked off the platform and left the chamber. By the next cycle, everything changed. Delegations began pulling trade permissions from Talvari license routes. Informal coalitions formed between minor species, seeking to audit their diplomatic frameworks. The Concord, desperate to maintain legitimacy, issued an official review, but only after half a dozen member states requested independent investigations. They didn't call it exposure. They called it systems integrity validation. Helena didn't care what they called it. She cared that they were moving. But the real shift came 3 cycles later. In a closed-door summit, Ellerin and Shidar commanders, military, not diplomatic, met in neutral space, not to accuse, to compare data. They shared intelligence they'd previously withheld from their own diplomats. And for the first time, they found overlap. The Talvari's ghost routes, matched metadata, altered neural burst keys. The signs had always been there, just scattered, compartmentalized, delayed. Helena was invited unofficially to attend the debrief. She didn't speak. She just watched as 2 empires, once inches from war, began cataloging their mutual manipulation. And in that quiet, something else emerged. A human idea. That cooperation isn't born from trust. It's born from shared betrayal. That was the seed. Earth's diplomatic standing surged overnight. Not because of victory, but because of vulnerability. Humanity had shown its cards early, taken all the risk, and asked for nothing. That made the other species nervous and intrigued. Requests for human mediators increased, not because humans were incorruptible, but because they had proven they didn't play clean. They played real. Helena returned to Earth 4 cycles later. No parade, no accolades. Just a quiet exit from the Concord Citadel, and a file marked Category 7 Disruption Event logged under her name. She didn't care. She had done what she came to do. The war hadn't started. That was the win. Months later, a small package arrived at her residence. No return signature. Just a tiny obsidian data chip etched with an unfamiliar symbol. When she ran it through quarantine protocols, the message was short. "We see the threads now. Your noise broke the silence. It will not be forgotten." No name, but the signature pulse was unmistakably Ellerin. She closed the file, encrypted it, and archived it. Not because she feared it, because it was done. The story had passed from her hands into the hands of others. That was how real change happened, not through power, but through propagation. Helena stepped out into the quiet morning light of a planet that had no idea how close it had come to becoming irrelevant in a galactic power game. She smiled faintly. Diplomacy wasn't about peace. It was about clarity. And clarity when wielded with precision, could be more devastating than any weapon.